There are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. But there are also unknown knowns. We are the ancient and esoteric order of the Jackalope, a secret society devoted to unearthing and sharing this forgotten knowledge. I hope everything's doing well up there. I'm still stuck down here in the secret recording bunker with no real communication with the outside world. Still being driven nuts by this bird song, as you can hear in the background. Hopefully they will pipe in something different soon. This week's subject raised a number of legal questions which I was not equipped to answer. So I brought in an expert, number 23, a prominent Pennsylvania lawyer who was more than willing to answer any legal questions we had. This episode will be interspersed with clips from our interview. Without further ado, here is this week's episode. French Leave, presented by number 13 and number 23. It was time. The National League had been the dominant force in baseball ever since it was formed in 1876. Sure, there were rival leagues from time to time, the American Association, the Union Association, the Players' League, but the National League had defeated them all with a deft combination of superior play, clever marketing, and underhanded business practices. The 1900 season had not been a good one for the National League. Attendance was down, way down, so at the end of the year the league announced that it would drop 4 of its 12 teams. Van Johnson, president of the minor league Western League, saw an opening. He saw that fans weren't bored with baseball, they were bored with the National League. In 1901, he renamed the Western League to the snappier American League, started teams in 3 of the cities abandoned by the National League, and added other new teams to directly compete with existing National League franchises. More importantly, the new league refused to re-sign the National Agreement, the anti-competitive compact signed by all the minor leagues, forcing them to abide by National League contracts. Since those contracts used a reserve clause, preventing players from negotiating with other teams, and an option clause allowing the team to renew contracts at will, players were essentially bound to the same team for life. Now, what can you tell us about the reserve and option clauses?
The reserve clause primarily is a device used by the owners to create stability in their organization, especially when you have a professional sports league. Basically, it is a clause whereby the owners could designate a certain number of players as indispensable players that other teams could not negotiate with. And it basically locked that player into playing for the team he was with if he was designated as one of those indispensable players. Now, that's the reserve clause, but the unique thing about the reserve clause in this case is the teams had a right to designate 5 players at one point. Then they increased that to 11 players, and that's significant because there were only 14 players on a team. So the whole team was designated as...
Everybody except the ball boy, I'm assuming.
Yeah. So basically they were trying to prevent exactly what happened, raids on their team, other people coming in and offering to pay a little bit more money and getting them. Now the option clause was a little different. The option clause was that the team had a right to exercise an option in the contract to say, look, we're gonna bind you to another 2 or 3 years of work for us. That could only be done by exercising this option to play for 2 or 3 more years. But there was no corresponding right of the player to say, no, I don't have that, or I can play with somebody else. What it boiled down to was this. He had to either take that, like I said, take it or leave it. And the team also, on the other side of it, they could say, look, we don't want you to play for us anymore, give you 10 days notice and be gone with you. So the gist of this option clause was that the teams could lock in these players for 3 years by exercising the option, and yet kick them out in 10 days if they didn't want them around anymore. Hardly a fair deal.
To top it off, the National League also unilaterally imposed a $2,400 salary cap on all players in 1894, well below the market values of their services. Many NL owners found ways to pay superstars under the table, but they were never very generous. Why would they be? They were the only game in town. When the American League dropped out of the National Agreement, they simultaneously launched a massive talent raid on the National League clubs. Ultimately, they signed away some of the best players in the National League, like Iron Man Joe McGinty, Turkey Mike Donlin, Roger Bresnahan, Chick Stahl, Jimmy Collins, John McGraw, and, oh yeah, some guy you may have heard of called Cy Young. Indignant National League owners fought back in court, led by their legal counsel, Colonel John Ignatius Rogers, owner of the Philadelphia Phillies. Rogers' Phillies were a prime target for the talent raids Because Rogers himself was not particularly well loved. John Schiffert's Baseball in Philadelphia memorably describes him as self-promoting, stubborn, arrogant, overbearing, enraged, gloating, litigious, bitter, mean-spirited, long-winded, meddler, suspicious, strident, and manipulative. Schiffert could have also added cheap. Rogers was the chief architect of the National League's reserve clause and salary cap, and seemed to delight in keeping player salaries as low as possible. When given a chance to get out from under Rogers' thumb, players took it willingly. When the dust cleared, the Phillies had lost 4 key players: pitchers Frosty Bill Duggleby, Strawberry Bill Bernard, and Chick Frazier, and second baseman Napoleon Lajoie. Lajoie, nicknamed Nap or Larry, or sometimes just Frenchie, was the real steal. These days, we tend to forget how good Nap was, but here's all you need to know. He was the 6th player admitted to the Baseball Hall of Fame. When the only strike against you is that maybe you're not quite as good as Ty Cobb or Babe Ruth, you're in some pretty rarefied company. In 1901, Lajoie was still an up-and-coming star. He'd had 5 amazing seasons, hitting over .320 in each, batting in more than 100 runs twice, and stealing more than 20 bases thrice. No matter how cheap he was, Rogers knew he had to keep a player like that happy, and he slipped Nap $200 under the table in 1900. But then Nap found out that Rogers had been slipping team captain Ed Delahanty, who had similar stats, $600. In 1901, he refused to re-sign his contract extension unless Rogers made up the $400 difference for the previous year. So when Ben Shive and Connie Mack of the newly formed Philadelphia Athletics offered Lajoie a multi-year contract with $4,000 a year, Lajoie switched clubs without hesitation. Supposedly, Rogers offered to match the Athletics contract, and Lajoie was ready to agree, but only if he got the $400 he felt he was owed for 1900. Rogers refused, and Lajoie left. Rogers wasn't going to take it lying down, though. In March 1901, he went to the Pennsylvania Court of Common Pleas and filed for an injunction to prevent Lajoie from playing for the Athletics. Rogers, who had drafted the reserve and option clauses himself, was absolutely convinced that they were ironclad. The Athletics were equally convinced that they were completely unenforceable. Both sides relished a chance to prove their arguments in court. Rogers, having drafted the clauses, is obviously convinced that they're great because he's a giant egomaniac who thinks he can do no wrong. Why would the American League might think that these clauses were unenforceable?
Okay, well, let's go back to Rogers himself. First off, we're dealing with contract law, written documents. And there's been contract law in existence for 200 to 300 years for the English common law. A basic contract requires an offer, acceptance, consideration, various burdens on both sides, a meeting of the minds, intent to be bound by the contract, and certainty of terms. Okay? The reason contracts were deemed inviolate, your word is your bond, your written word is your is your badge of honor, so to speak. You live up to your word. So what was written and signed was considered inviolate. So that's one of the reasons why I suppose that Rogers thought he was invincible and could walk into court, because one, Knapp signed the contract. He agreed to all the stuff that he was now disagreeing with. The contract was clear and unambiguous, and as written by Rogers, everybody knew what was going on. The 10-day clause was in there. The reserve clause was in there. Whether Lajoie understood it, we don't know, but he signed it anyhow. Rogers also felt that he could prove irreparable harm if the contract wasn't enforced, which is that the Phillies would lose a lot of money because Knapp wasn't going to play for them. And that was a big deal because Lajoie was a very, very big draw. When he did go play for the A's got 10,500 people to see him on the first day. The Phillies only had 750 or so. Then also Rogers thought, hey, the A's are stealing my player and I'm not getting any money from them. So I'm losing all the way around, and this wasn't right. Somehow or other, I have to have some remedy available to me so I can have this contract enforced. And the only way he could go into court and do that was to request for an injunction. We talked about the reserve clause and the option clause, but we didn't talk about specific performance. Here's the contract. I'm going to pay you $2,400. You have to play baseball for the Phillies. The contract also had a clause for specific performance, which is that Lajoie agreed to that remedy in court. If there was a violation of contract, that the Phillies could go into court and order him to specifically play for the Phillies. Lajoie signed that too. And that's why Rogers was so firm that he thought he would prevail. It was ironclad and he couldn't lose. Why the American League thought it was objectionable and that they thought they would win was basically the fairness side of the argument. The contract was one-sided. It was either play or not play, and he could dictate all the terms, and that wasn't fair. And it was an unconscionable deal where he was basically bound for life to the Phillies, where the Phillies could just cut him adrift in 10 days. And those arguments have always been present in the law, especially the written law, where one side has more power than the other in a bargaining agreement. That's basically the forces that were set up for a resolution by the court.
The case went before a judge in early April. First, the Athletics went after the contract on technicalities. Lajoie had apparently signed his original contract in pencil, not pen. He had never received a personal copy of the contract, and the option had only been signed by one of the club's managers, but was supposed to have been signed by two. These might seem like picayune objections to you, but they're good lawyering. Throw out every argument you can think of in the hope that one of them sticks. The rest of the arguments went mostly as expected. The Athletics argued that the reserve and option clauses were onerous and one-sided. The Phillies argued that they were entirely fair and had been standard boilerplate in league contracts for years, as if that somehow made them more enforceable. There was at least one moment of levity in the courtroom. While arguing against the reserve clause, which was usually used for indispensable experts whose loss would lead to irreparable harm, Athletics lawyers managed to get manager William Shetzlin of the Phillies to begrudgingly admit that he considered every man on his team an expert, with the exception of third base coach Pierce Childs, who had been demoted from outfielder to third base coach and then fired after getting caught stealing signs. After a few weeks, a ruling came in. For the panel, Judge Ralston wrote,
"It was stated at argument that the baseball clubs have found it necessary to reserve the right to discharge, that without it the business must be discontinued. This may be so, but if the clause is so important that it cannot be omitted, then the benefits arising from it must compensate for the lack of the remedy by injunction, for a court of equity will not enforce specific performance of a contract or enjoin the breach of it while one party is bound for a series of years, while the other may annul it at any time upon giving 10 days' notice. If the court were to enjoin the defendant for the balance of the period for which he agreed to play for the plaintiff, there would be no way to compel the plaintiff to employ him or pay him a salary for more than 10 days. Such a contract is lacking in mutuality, and a court of equity will leave the parties to the remedies at law. The injunction is refused, and the bill is dismissed."
Now, Judge Ralston's decision here seems to hinge on mutuality of contract. Can you briefly describe the principle of mutuality?
Mutuality is a very confusing concept because sometimes it gets broken down into two other concepts. But again, it borrows the idea that there's equality of burdens to a certain extent, okay? But they break it down even further, and this is where it gets confusing. You can have mutuality of obligation. It's a fair deal all the way around. You'll play baseball for me, I'll pay you $2,400. That seems like a fairly simple, easy deal, mutual burden. That's the burdens. The remedies, what can somebody do for you? What are your rights to compensation or relief if the contract's breached? Well, the remedies were a little different. So mutuality of obligation is one thing, mutuality of remedy is another, and that's where people get confused when those two terms get intertwined. And it's almost impossible to keep them unintertwined, if you know what I mean, because the remedy in this case was the Phillies could keep him on for 3 years just by exercising the option. Lajoie had no other right or remedy. He could get kicked out in 10 days, or his contract could be terminated in 10 days, but he had no similar right against the Phillies to say, you must pay me for 3 years. No. To a certain extent, that makes some sense in terms of professional sports because, as we all know, people get hurt, they lose their skills, they lose their ability.
Sham retirements.
Yeah, true. But the mutuality of what the court considered in this case was it was the 10-day clause where Nap could be let go after 10 days notice. They thought that wasn't a fair deal. They thought the remedy wasn't mutual. Therefore, they struck the whole contract as void for lack of mutuality of remedy, not mutuality of obligation.
Rogers railed against the decision in the papers, arguing that a contract enforceable in a court of law should not have specific enforcement in a court of equity. But for now, the case was settled. The Athletics had won.
The dispute between law and equity, okay? law is, if you're in a contract of law, say you enter in a contract, I'm going to give you, I will pay $1 a horseshoe for 500 horseshoes, and you deliver me 500 horseshoes. Okay, simple deal. It's a simple contract, and it's a legal contract, and it's enforceable in a court of law. Okay, but only enforceable to the extent that we'll pay you money if you breach the contract. One party will have to pay the other side money if the contract's breached. Pragmatically speaking, we all know that there are other things that are involved in a breach of contract that don't involve money or can't be solved by payment of money. So if he signs a contract to play for the Phillies and now he's playing for somebody else, no amount of money is going to bring him back if he doesn't want to play. And Nap doesn't have enough money to pay the Phillies for all their loss of profit in any given year.
And for that matter, how much could you prove that profit was due to Nap? I mean,
That's
certainly
true.
there are other factors as well.
There are 13 other members of the team. Exactly. And bottom line is you then go to the consideration of the equity side of the court. A court also has two hats. One hat is the law side. The other hat is the equity side. And the equity side is the fairness, the reasonableness. You can't do contracts against public policy. You have to be reasonable. Those sort of considerations, but specifically when it comes to ordering things other than money. In this case, they wanted specific performance. The Phillies went into court to require Lajoie to play for the Phillies or to stop him from playing for the Philadelphia Athletics or any other team. That doesn't involve money. That involves prohibition or enjoining, they call it enjoining certain conduct. And that's the equity side of the courts, the fairness side, the equitable side, which involves something more than just basic contract analysis.
Meanwhile, Nap Lajoie had the season of his life. He led the league in 8 offensive categories: batting average, 422, slugging, 643, hits, 232, total bases, 350, doubles, 48, home runs, 14, runs scored, 145, and RBIs, 125. But even though their star won the Triple Crown, the Athletics only finished in 4th place. The Phillies had to make do with Bill Hallman at second. Hallman hit a pathetic 184, far below the Mendoza line. To be fair to Mario Mendoza, he wouldn't even be born for another 49 years. Somehow, the Phils still managed to finish second, 7.5 games behind the first place Pittsburgh Pirates. Go Bucks. Rogers and the Phillies appealed the Court of Common Pleas ruling to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Arguments were heard in front of the court in mid-November, though the judges took their time thinking over the merits of the case. In the meantime, the National League established a corruption fund to try and lure American League players back into the fold. The New York Giants offered Nap a 3-year contract worth $7,000 a year, which Lajoie politely declined. The Supreme Court's ruling did not come down until April 22, 1902, almost a month into the season. It was a stunning reversal.
The legal principle that contracts must be mutual does not mean that in every case each party must have the same remedy for a breach as the other. Mere difference in rights stipulated for does not destroy mutuality of remedy. Freedom of contract covers a wide range of obligation and duty as between the parties, and it may not be impaired so as long as the bounds of reasonableness and fairness are not transgressed.
My understanding as I'm reading this is that the Supreme Court considered the mutuality of remedy here is that the contract was a Hobson's choice. Lajoie could either take it or leave it. That was his mutuality of remedy, sign or not sign.
Well, that was part of it, but yet they also noticed that, he wasn't getting nothing. He was getting $2,400 if he signed the contract. There was a reserve clause in it, and the court basically said, he could have objected. Now, where that would have got him, I don't know. But the court said he could have objected to that provision in the contract. Whether the Phillies would have taken it out, I don't know. But he signed, and so again, we come back to that. Your contract is inviolate. Your written word is your bond, so to speak.
So their basic consideration here is that because Lajoie has the option of not playing baseball at all, the contract is still mutual.
I'm going to say this, that this is not the finest hour of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
I tried reading the ruling, and it seemed like some pretty dense legalese, so it was hard to read and even harder for a layman to understand. Did you find it similar?
Yes, I do. Even the modern commentators who try to analyze it have some difficulty in boiling it down to its essence. But I think the bottom line is they say you signed a contract, you're bound by it.
A telegram with news of the injunction was sent to the Athletics and arrived during a game against the Baltimore Orioles. When Connie Mack read it, he pulled Lajoie from the lineup in the middle of the 8th inning. Nap would not play for weeks while American League lawyers debated how to proceed. Rogers gloated and told the press that Nap would be back under his thumb any day now, so he was surprised when in early June Lajoie was traded from the Athletics to the Cleveland Broncos. The American League had public opinion and precedent on their side. Pennsylvania was the only state that ruled in the National League's favor in these contract disputes. Courts in Missouri, New York, and Washington, D.C. had all ruled for the American League. In fact, the Missouri court specifically called out the Pennsylvania decision, calling it inequitable, unconscionable, and contrary to public policy. Based on that, American League lawyers ultimately decided that the Supreme Court's injunction would not be enforceable outside the state of Pennsylvania.
Now, why would it be unenforceable outside of Pennsylvania? Obviously, we have intrastate contracts signed all the time. Criminal law obviously has special things where if you flee across state lines, there are federal organizations that are designed to enforce that. But why would a contract enforcement not be possible across state lines?
Well, full faith and credit of may apply to certain types of orders of the Supreme Court of one state. But when there is lack of jurisdiction, remember now, this is a Philadelphia case. It started out in the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas, and it found its way to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. And at the time, Lajoie was in Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia Phillies were in Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia A's were in Philadelphia. So everything was concentrated in Philadelphia. And hence, it was easy for a Philadelphia court to say, okay, we're going to void the contract. The bottom line is all the parties were in Pennsylvania. So now, when you go to another court, another state, and the parties, maybe one party isn't a resident of that other state, they call it in personam jurisdiction. If the parties aren't there, all the parties aren't there, sometimes the court doesn't believe they have the power or right to enter any orders that affect those people.
Connie Mack traded Lajoie to the Broncos, partly as a favor to their owner, a personal friend, and partly as a favor to the league, which was trying to bolster attendance for the struggling Cleveland franchise. And it worked. Lajoie couldn't carry the whole Cleveland team on his back, but he could lift it to the middle of the standings with his league-leading .378 batting average. Rogers was furious. He had Lajoie declared in contempt of court and tried to serve injunctions against him, but Pennsylvania sheriffs returned the injunctions endorsed non est inventus. The enjoined could not be found. But the injunctions did mean that Nap Lajoie was a wanted man in the state of Pennsylvania. Since he risked arrest by even setting foot into the state, Lajoie made separate travel arrangements that allowed him to avoid the Keystone State entirely. When the Broncos had to play the Athletics in Philadelphia, he'd chill in Atlantic City for a few days and then join up with the team afterwards. For 1902, that's superstar treatment. Manager Bill Armour jokingly called the entire situation French leave. Since he couldn't lay a finger on Lajoie in Pennsylvania, Rogers filed for an injunction in the Ohio Court of Common Pleas, but Judge Wing dismissed the suit in August on the rather technical grounds that it had no jurisdiction to enforce Pennsylvania laws on a resident of Vermont.
Well, the actual ruling was that the Ohio court was not compelled to enforce a decree for a specific performance of the Pennsylvania contract. Okay, they didn't actually disagree with the ruling, and they sort of gave it lip service and said, oh, that's a nice decision, but we're not going to enforce it because it calls for specific performance of a contract made in Pennsylvania, and we're not, here we are in Ohio, we're not going to do that, how much of that was because the judges were in the pocket of the Cleveland Indians, we'll never know, will we?
Rogers was fit to be tied, but this time there was nothing the Colonel could do. In the offseason, the rival leagues buried the hatchet and signed a new national agreement. The reserve and option clauses that had been decried as monstrous and inequitable soon became standard parts of the American League contract. As part of the peace treaty, the teams allowed players who jumped to stay where they'd landed. In cases where a player had conflicting contracts, an arbitration committee would determine which team had the better claim. One owner who wasn't happy about all of this was Colonel John Rogers, who argued that the league did not have the legal authority to sign away his contractual rights. Unfortunately for Rogers, his team had seen declining attendance and was losing money hand over fist. He was pressured to sell the team to another management group and was out of baseball. Thank God. But one player who still had a problem was Nap Lajoie, who was a wanted man in Pennsylvania. In May 1903, the Athletics, Broncos, and Phillies all filed an injunction for relief in advance of a Broncos Athletics series in early June. Amazingly, the petition wound up on the docket of Judge Ralston, who had handed down the original ruling in Lajoie's favor. Ralston apparently thought that all of the parties in the original suit had been acting abominably and deserved every punishment that had come their way. But in the interests of peace, he set the injunction aside. But he did wait until the last second to issue his ruling. Nap Lajoie was a free man once again. He would continue to play and manage for Cleveland until 1914, and was so beloved that they even renamed the team the Cleveland Naps in his honor. He played one more season for the Philadelphia Athletics in 1915, spent a few years in the minors, and then retired. In 1937, he was elected to the second class of the Baseball Hall of Fame. John Rogers had been forced to sell his interest in the Phillies, but he'd retained ownership of their ballpark. Unfortunately, the notoriously cheap Rogers didn't keep up on maintenance. A balcony collapse in August 1903 killed 12 and injured hundreds, and the resulting lawsuits ruined him. Major league players would continue to be indefinitely bound by the reserve and option clauses until Curt Flood and Marvin Miller established free agency in 1972.
Would you say that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's ruling had any ongoing influence on sports law going forward?
Well, strangely, and even though a bunch of other courts have refused to abide it, it does have some ongoing significance in terms of basic contract law. Let's set this up a little bit, because you have a decision issued by the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, which is the highest court of one state. And we all know there's a hierarchy of laws. So it goes from Supreme Court, it goes from the lower courts, the trial courts, to the Superior Court, the intermediate state. And then, so the law of any given state is whatever the Supreme Court says it is. But here you've got rinky-dink courts in Missouri saying this contract, the same contract that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court looked at, in essence, was inequitable, unconscionable, contrary to public policy, all these things you said before, violated antitrust provisions, deprived players of due process, and even one said constituted involuntary servitude, which I could see that. It's a little stretch, but then
find a civil rights claim in a baseball law argument.
Yeah. But another interesting facet of this was that this guy Rogers, who must have had immense hubris, went into federal court in Philadelphia a month after the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania's decision. 1 month later, he went into federal court, but not in a Phillies case. It was a case where he was suing on behalf of the Brooklyn Baseball Club because, it was a Brooklyn case. It was all the parties were in New York, but he filed this case in the federal court in Philadelphia. And the federal court in Philadelphia completely rejected the arguments of the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania and said that this was not a unique contract. It was an unfair and inequitable contract, and the injunction should not have been granted. At least for the Brooklyn team. So now we've got a case where multiple courts are arrayed against the Pennsylvania Supreme Court on this issue, but yet over time, the notion of mutuality of contract and its ruling on mutuality of contract has actually taken hold because it's the highest court of a state. When other states start looking at decisions for precedential value and to support it, they don't go looking for Court of Common Pleas at Cuyahoga County or some local low court in Missouri. They look for the highest decision of the state, of any given state. And so the Pennsylvania Supreme Court decision does have, is given some credence among legal scholars. And in this case, the mutuality of contract provision of the determination of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court has been given significance, that the 10-day provision does not in and of itself render a contract void for lack of mutuality.
Even though at the contemporary time that argument was rejected by almost every other state court and federal court that heard the case, the years of time have stripped out the context, and so the ruling itself is seen out of context and still has precedential value, essentially.
That's correct. Very, very succinct synopsis.
Wow.
Connections. It's a very tenuous connection, but it's still a connection. Obviously, the Philadelphia Athletics moved west, becoming the Kansas City Athletics, and then even further west, becoming the Oakland Athletics. In 1976, they fielded baseball's only designated runner, Hurricane Herb Washington. Hurricane Herb's exploits were the subject of our Series 2 episode, Hurricane Coming Through. For sources, we consulted a lot of period newspapers and books about old-timey baseball, but the best source we found was C. Paul Rogers III's Napoleon LaJoie, Breach of Contract in the Great Baseball War from the SMU Law Review. It's a wonderful article that lays out the whole case in black and white in as simple a language as you could ever imagine in a law review. It's a great article, and I'm so glad I only stumbled across it very late in the drafting process, because if I stumbled across it at the beginning, I would have just given it up because it's that definitive. This episode was produced by David White and David White for the Ancient and Esoteric Order of the Jackalope podcast and is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 international license. All rights reserved, all wrongs reversed. The script of this episode, along with sources, links, and more, can be found on our website at orderofthejackalope.com. That's orderofthejackalope.com with hyphens between the words. You can keep up with our research, release schedule, and more on our social media accounts. We can be found at Order Jackalope on Twitter, Instagram, Tumblr, and Reddit. That's Order Jackalope without a hyphen because our branding is not consistent. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends, or your enemies, or even total strangers. We're not picky. Hey, you! Want to join the fastest growing secret society in the nation? Of course you do. But before you can be initiated into the hidden secrets, you've got to share a hidden secret of your own. Visit our website at orderofthejackalope.com for more information. And since this episode will be dropping the week before Father's Day, let me just say, number 23, you're the greatest father a boy could ever have. I love you. Happy Father's Day.